Hey there, it's Laria. In this video, I'll go over some healer tips and also some general raid tips for Heroic, Council of Blood, Darkvein, Sludgefist, and Stone Legion generals. This video will not include Sire Denathrius because my next video will be a deep dive into the Heroic Sire Denathrius fight, which will go over healing positioning and raid positioning and healing cooldowns. The first fight I want to go over is Heroic Council of Blood, and this fight is pretty straightforward in terms of healing. It's not too difficult. As long as your raid remembers to interrupt Dreadbolt Volley, that definitely makes healing a lot easier if you can interrupt every single one of those. And another thing that makes it easier to heal on this boss is the order in which you kill the bosses. Because there are 3 of them, it matters which one you kill first and second and third. So my guild always kills Stavros first, and then Frida, and then Niklaus. And that way we know the order and we don't have a lot of bad overlaps with mechanics. Another thing that makes this fight pretty easy to heal is the fact that we have a little mini game, or whatever you want to call it, Dance Macabre, and this is a time for healers to regenerate a little bit of mana, as well as get a stacking haste buff. The first tip I have is about Dark Recital, and when this goes out, it targets a couple of people and you get paired up with somebody else. And you have to run to that other person and you have to move together because both of you leave these blood circles on the ground behind you, kind of like a trail. So you have to be moving together, but you take more damage the farther you are apart, so that's why you have to stay together and you also have to move together. This is important for healers because there's a bit of raid-wide damage going out at this moment, and so it's important to be able to have some kind of healing cooldown that you can use on the move. I usually try to save Convoke the Spirits for this one, or maybe Flourish if I can get some hots out and then get everybody chopped up kind of quickly. Whether you're selected for Dark Recital or not, it's important to be able to prepare for this because you know that the raid is going to be taking damage, and if you don't have Dark Recital, you might have pairs of players running around you, leaving a trail of these blood swirls around you, then forcing you to move. So it's important to have something that you can heal with on the go, like Tree of Life, or Convoke, or Flourish, so that even if you're not partnered up with somebody else, you have some kind of healing cooldown that you can use and rely on as you're moving. The next fight I want to go over is Heroic Lady Inerva Darkvein, and this fight is all about coordination and communication. There are a lot of different abilities and mechanics that hurt the entire raid. There is a ton of raid-wide damage that goes on this fight. My first tip for healers is to make sure that you are prepared when a vial is emptied on this fight. This fight has 4 vials and they all periodically fill up throughout the fight, and so it's your raid leader's job to call out when to empty certain vials. And I'm not going to go over what each vial does, but just know that when a vial is emptied, it pulsates damage to the entire raid. So the first few seconds you might not notice anything, but after the first few seconds you'll definitely start to notice that the entire raid will probably be taking damage, and that is why you need to prep for that damage either as a Resto Druid or whatever healer you're playing, because you know that that damage is definitely incoming. As a Resto Druid, I know that when my raid leader calls for somebody to empty a vial, then I know that there is going to be some incoming damage to the raid. So I make sure that I get as many hots out as possible. Sometimes I might use Flourish for whenever we empty a vial. Sometimes I'll use Tree of Life if the damage is really that bad and it has ramped up towards the end. Depending on when your raid needs your healing cooldowns in the fight, this could be a time when a vial is emptied to use something like Tranquility or Divine Hymn or Salvation. But again, it depends on where your healing cooldowns are spread out, because you want to make sure that you're not using every single major healing cooldown every time a vial is emptied. And you want to especially save cooldowns because towards the end of the fight, everybody is taking way more damage than you are at the start of the fight. So you want to make sure that you're not popping every single major cooldown each time a vial is emptied, but you also make sure that you have enough healing cooldowns and enough healing so that you don't fall behind after a vial is emptied. The next tip I have is actually a general raid tip, so it's not just for healers, it's for everybody. And this has to do with knowing when you are targeted with Shared Suffering. Shared Suffering is when you get selected and you have a red line that goes to 2 other players. And you'll see that 3 orbs have spawned around the room, and you need to get over to your orb, and the other 2 players need to get to an orb so that you form a triangle. Explaining this, if you just say, hey, go and make a triangle, it sounds really simple, but what I'm noticing is that it's really difficult for players to be able to go and locate their triangles, stand on them in the correct angle to make sure the lines line up with the orbs and things like that, and it just seems like one of those mechanics that groups are struggling with. And so my tip is to make sure you either have a weak aura or you have a air horn sound or something from DBM, know when you have shared suffering and go over to the orb to finish that mechanic. Because if you don't, or if somebody else in that 3-person group doesn't, then they or you are going to kill other players. The damage just ramps up. I believe shared suffering lasts for 60 seconds, and so the damage just keeps going up and up and up, and eventually all 3 players are going to die, or at least 1 player is going to die. It's not good. So make sure that you save your raid, make sure you know when you have shared suffering. The next fight I want to go over is Heroic Sludgefist. And Sludgefist is also a pretty easy fight. For the most part, it's just managing your chain partner and dodging stuff on the ground. So I mentioned that you have to manage chains. What I mean by chains is that some players in the raid are selected and they have a partner, and you get chained up with them. And this lasts for quite a while, and you have to stay with that partner. If you stray too far away from them, then the chain will break and you both will die. If your partner dies, then you also die. Things like that. So you have to really make sure that you're following that person, you're dodging stuff on the ground, which means that you and your partner need to be moving in the same direction pretty much at all times. And you need to be aware of where you are, you need to be planning your next step, and your partner also needs to be on the same page as you. In my guild, we decided to mark a ranged stack person. And so for our first kill, I was the ranged stack person. So that meant that I was leading the group. I had a mark over my head. And this was really helpful because what we ran into before marking a healer is that we had a ranged mark. And the ranged mark was way too far away from the tanks. And on this fight, tanks take a ton of damage. And it's really important that all the healers are able to target the tanks and be in range of them. So if a tank calls for Iron Bark or Pain Suppression or some kind of external, or you see that they just took a chunk of damage and you need to top them off a little bit, then you need to be able to be in range of them to react immediately. And so we realized that having a ranged stack person wasn't as good, at least on our first kill, because healers were constantly having to inch forward a little bit, moving farther and farther away from their chain partners. And so we ended up marking myself, and that was easy because we could stand at max distance and all of the healers were able to be in range of the tanks. The next tip I have for Sludgefist is to make sure that you are standing a little bit farther ahead than the rubble that's on the ground, all the ceiling crumble that falls to the floor. You'll see that circles will spawn around you. And the reason for this is because when the boss casts Roar, he knocks everybody back. He basically pushes the entire raid back. You can keep casting during this knockback, but the important thing is that if you are standing far enough ahead of all the rubble on the ground, then you won't get pushed into it. And the rubble on the ground doesn't do too much damage to everybody, but if the entire raid gets pushed into it, then that's making the healers' jobs a little bit more difficult because all the healers are having to heal everybody back up. And instead, if you can just position a little bit farther ahead of the rubble on the ground, then when he does Roar and the boss knocks you back, you won't be knocked back into all the stuff on the ground. Another time when you can rely on using the boss's cast Roar is when he does Chain Slam. And Chain Slam is when you have this circle, it picks somebody, you get into that circle, and the boss pulls everybody to him who's in that circle. And instead of wasting time and running back to your original position away from the boss, you can actually just plant your feet underneath the boss after Chain Slam, because he immediately goes into Roar, and the Roar pushes you right back where you originally started. So if you run back to where you started, then you have your DPS who aren't able to cast, you have healers who aren't able to cast, and instead, like I said, you can just plant there, you can start casting, and when the boss casts Roar, you can finish your cast because the knockback doesn't actually interrupt anybody, and you just basically kind of shave off some moving time. My last tip for healers has to do with Falling Rebel, and Falling Rebel is when there are random circles that spawn on the ground. Sometimes it's in melee, sometimes it's on the range group, and my tip for healers is to make sure that you don't start casting Tranquility or Divine Hymn during this, because if you are with the range group and you stack with them and you pop Trank, and then Falling Rebel comes out a couple seconds later on you, then you're going to have to break your Divine Hymn channel or your Tranquility channel and start moving, and it just ends up being a waste of a healing cooldown. So in general, my tip is to try not to cast Tranquility or Divine Hymn when Falling Rebel is about to come out, unless you are planning it specifically. So for example, I usually trank the second Pillar Smash. And the second Pillar Smash is immediately followed up with Falling Rubble. So what I do in advance is if I have a chain partner, I make sure I'm far enough away from them where I'm still close and I'm not going to break our chain. And I get as far away from the range group as possible. And then I start tranking right before the boss hits the pillar. And that way, when the pillar is followed up with Falling Rubble, it's not going to be on me. If it's on the range group, I'm not with the range group. I'm a couple yards away from them. But this really requires some planning. You have to make sure you know where the range group is. You have to make sure that you know where you are and what your next step is going to be. The last fight I want to go over is Heroic Stone Legion Generals. And Generals has a lot of moving parts to this fight. There are a lot of abilities and mechanics and intermissions that overlap with each other, and there's a lot of movement on this fight. So one tip for this fight is to watch your feet, because there are a lot of abilities that you have to not stand in, or abilities that you should stand in, like Crystallize, when you have to split the damage. There is Seismic Upheaval, there are Blood Bombardments, there are intermissions where you have to keep moving. So just knowing where your character is, looking around yourself, knowing, okay, if something spawns under my feet, what's my backup plan? Am I moving forward? Am I moving to the right? If someone else is standing to your right and Seismic Upheaval is happening, you know that you can't move over to your right because Seismic Upheaval is probably going to spawn under that person as well. So just watching your feet and thinking a couple of steps ahead. My next tip is to make sure that you have some healing cooldowns ready for the intermissions and high moving parts of this fight. Intermissions, for example, there is a lot of movement. There is a lot of movement that happens and you're not really able to plant your feet and cast for a while. You might be able to stop and cast one spell, but for the most part you are dodging bombardments, you're dodging upheaval, you're getting out of the way of blades, things like that. And so you want to make sure that you have any healing cooldowns that you can use on the move. So Convoke the Spirits might be really good if you are the Night Fae. If you're Resto Druid, you could also use Flourish for this, because if you know an intermission is coming up, then you can start ramping for that. You can start getting your hots out, so that way when intermission does happen, you can wait for the damage to hit and then hit Flourish and top everybody back up. My next tip is more of a general raid tip, and it has to do with two separate mechanics on this fight that are really important that you understand and also know which one you have. And those are Crystallize and Reverberating Eruption. And Crystallize is when you get a ginormous circle around yourself. It looks like you might have some ground effects under your feet. It's kind of brown, but either way, you have a circle around yourself. That is when you kind of get closer to melee. Our group kind of puts it right in between the range group and the melee group so that people can soak easily. There's not a lot of movement. One of the important things to remember about Crystallize is that the first hit removes any bleed effects on anybody. So whether it's yourself or anybody else who soaks this very first hit. So either way, if you don't have Crystallize and you also don't have a bleed, you want to make sure that you are not in this because it'll stun you for a few seconds. However, Crystallize does a second hit. So as soon as it stuns the player who got it and anyone else who's standing in the middle of it, it'll then do a second hit a couple of seconds later. This damage is split amongst everybody who's soaking that circle. So it's important to understand that Crystallize does involve you, even if you are not targeted with Crystallize, because you should be going in to stack with the second hit. And now this can get a little confusing because Reverberating Eruption is also kind of an earth-like ability. The animations are kind of similar, but the difference is that when you get Reverberating Eruption, you don't actually get animation around your character. So for me, I have my DBM set to an air horn. So whenever I get Reverberating Eruption, I have this air horn sound. It's really obnoxious, but I know that I need to get out of the group, which is really important because most groups are assigning the Reverberating Eruptions to very specific spots in the room. So if you have Reverberating Eruption, it is really bad if you stay in the middle of the group. You need to know whether you have Crystallize or whether you have Reverberating Eruption and make sure that you bring them to the appropriate spots in the room. I hope these raid tips help you as your raid group progresses on Heroic Castle Nathria. As I mentioned at the start of this video does not include Sire Denathrius because my next video is a deep dive into the Heroic Sire Denathrius fight where I will specifically go over positioning, healing cooldowns, and other tips for healers and raid members.
Kill the boss. Come on. We're not soaking, so we're just killing him.